modernity is not a European-American construct on its own. It involves a much more complex, long-standing involvement of other cultures. And in the case of China, the translation of Chinese ideas and practices was foundational.
Welcome back to The Responsible Edge, the podcast exploring how to balance profit with purpose in an increasingly complex world. I'm Charlie Martin, your host, founder of TrueMark, and our article this week is titled A Green World Order with Chinese Characteristics, Implications for Global Climate Cooperation, which is a fascinating look at how climate action is drifting from shared mission into a contest over green tech power, standards, and global influence. And I'm absolutely delighted to say that I've got a very special guest today to unpack all of this, Professor Paul Gladston, the UNSW Judith Nielsen Chair of Contemporary Art and a globally recognized scholar of contemporary Chinese art and visual culture. Paul, it's an absolute delight to have you on the show this morning. Thank you so much for giving up some of your time.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Charlie, and very much looking forward to this conversation.
Now, Paul, I have been particularly looking forward to this conversation because it's a little bit off the beaten track, if you like, I think, in terms of other shows that we've had on The Responsible Edge. And you very, very kindly have suggested in our preamble before the show that no question is a bad question. So we're very much going to be putting that to the test, I think, during today's show. So bear with me as I throw things at you. But for those of our listeners and viewers who are immediately scrambling to LinkedIn to try and find out more about you and your current work, can you just give us a brief introduction to your areas of focus at the moment in terms of what you do?
Sure. Well, as you say, currently I'm the University of New South Wales, Sydney, Judith Nielsen Chair Professor of Contemporary Art, which doesn't entirely explain what I do. Although I'm focused on contemporary art, my cultural focus is on China, or more accurately, the Sinosphere, which is the Chinese-speaking sphere globally, which includes diasporas, as well as mainland China, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. And because that's my focus, I traverse the boundaries between a European-American or Westernized and international view of contemporary art and culture, and that which pertains particularly to Chinese-speaking culture. And although there are significant links and relationships between the two, they are not identical. And it's that relationship of being similar but not identical, which is crucially important to my research. And just to say very briefly, before that, I was a professor at the University of Nottingham in the UK. And while I was at Nottingham University in the UK, I was seconded to the University of Nottingham, Ningbo, China, where I deepened my interest and engagement.
What is it about sort of Chinese culture and the influence of China that is so sort of attractive to you from an academic perspective? And what is it? Can you take us back to sort of some of those formative experiences that really drew you to Chinese culture?
I had have a long-standing interest in modern and contemporary art. And I started out back, around about 10 or 11. I used to spend my pocket money on art books. I used to go to remaindered bookshops and spend my money on art books about modern art and postmodernist art. I developed an attachment and an interest in that subject. Back in the day, in the UK, there were remaindered bookshops where you could buy very, very high quality art books for very little money. And that's partly what I spent my money on. But as part of that interest, it became clear to me that Asia, East Asia, Japan, China, had a cultural involvement in the development of contemporary art. So for many years, I was interested in East Asia and East Asian culture because of that connection. By the time I got to being invited to go and work in China, my question was, well, what can I do for research? To cut a long story short, I'd been aware of the development of contemporary art in China, that had developed from the late 70s onwards. And so I thought, well, I can go out there and I could meet some artists and I could do some research and I can produce a couple of articles and then go back to the UK. But of course, what happened was it's such a rich subject that I'm still working in that area. It's just that my kind of view of it has become hopefully richer and more sophisticated over time. And what was planned as 2 articles has turned into, 11 books and all sorts of other things, which people could find out about online.
Over all of the time that you've spent researching, Chinese art and culture and everything in between, what are some of the biggest surprises that you've uncovered for yourself personally that perhaps go against your preconceived ideas of what makes China China?
The initial focus was on art, and then it kind of developed more widely into visual culture and culture more generally, not just in China, but globally. And what I think that kind of extension sort of led me pretty much to these kinds of talks where I wasn't so focused on art. It wasn't an exclusive focus. It was focused on wider questions of cultural identity and the meaning of that, socially and politically, in a transcultural context. And what I mean by that is the construction of culture and the development of culture across seeming or apparent cultural boundaries. So, certainly for my generation and before that, there was a strong emphasis, unconscious emphasis often, that Europe and America had developed modernity, and that it had developed modernity in conjunction with others, but had been the leader in that. I think what we would now say, and certainly what I have addressed with greater levels of detail and sophistication over the past 20 years, is that modernity is not a European-American construct on its own. It involves a much more complex, long-standing involvement of other cultures. And in the case of China, the translation of Chinese ideas and practices was foundational. And the traces of those things were foundational on the development of European Romanticism during the 17th and 18th century. And before that, but certainly from the 17th and 18th century. So European modernity has certain traces of Chinese and East Asian culture, badly translated, it has to be said. It's never perfectly translated, but they are an important aspect of our view of modernity and the modern world and the postmodern and contemporary world. What I think I've come to understand more and more clearly is that when China is addressing modernity, it's not simply addressing European American modernity as a competitor or something to adapt or translate. It's also coming back to the traces of its own culture as part of the early development of modernity from the time of Romanticism. And therefore, that makes a much more complex phenomenon. It's not
complex in what way?
Well, because it's no longer a one-way street. This idea that somehow other cultures and other societies had to take on board Western, for want of a better term, Western and Westernized modernity. But that they were party to the development of that thing in the first instance. And that relay of constant interaction and translation is crucial, I think, to our understanding, not just of China, but actually the very diverse notions of modernity and practices of modernity that we're now involved in, particularly in the contemporary world, where we've addressed or we've begun to address the questions of post-colonialism and decoloniality. And one of the things that we need to address is that we're not looking at simply a kind of Western construct. It's already, in a sense, decolonized because it started out from multiple cultures.
Paul, it's fascinating how you're describing this, and I think actually, I mean, you know, we're recording here on the 22nd of January 2026, and you know, you just think about some of the media sentiment that we've seen at play during this week of Davos, and certain actors and agents and this discourse that's been presented. What you're describing to me, and again, tell me if I'm misconstruing this, but you know, in a world that is polarizing and pulling apart in many ways in terms of our discourse, it's actually the appreciation and understanding of the interconnectedness and the wovenness, if you like, of the influence that all parts of the world have had upon one another. And this sounds like the sort of message, if you like, that possibly for some political actors is an uncomfortable truth of the way that our modern world has been constructed from a cultural perspective. But equally, it sounds like a message that we could really do with at this time. You know, there's a lot more that binds us and makes us similar to one another than the things that we think draws us apart. Have I jumped too far with that observation, or is that a fair one?
No, the thing that I would add to that is that I think it's an uncomfortable proposition, regardless of one's political positioning. I think what you're alluding to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you know, if you take this kind of, for want of a better term, a sort of rather neo-colonial, neo-imperial American positioning, which has developed in recent years, it's certainly very uncomfortable from that point of view. You know, kind of asserting the value of Western civilization, as important as that is, and I wouldn't want to denigrate the values that are part of that, but it's not a monoculture. It's a complex relay, a dynamic unfolding relay. But I think that's equally uncomfortable for globalists. I mean, globalization and that kind of neoliberal position that we became used to in the early 2000s. That's not new. That grew out of romanticism, and that grew out of growing interconnectedness through colonialism and imperialism during the 18th, 19th, 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th century. You know, one might want to align oneself with that liberal point of view for lots of good reasons. But the problem is, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not a matter of choosing one or the other, if you like. It's more a matter of saying that there are complex forces, some of which are imperialist and are not only Western imperialist. I mean, China has its own imperialist tendencies, which go back much, much further than Europe. It has to be said, a bit differently constructed. But, you know, when I was first in China, it was at the high watermark of that kind of liberal, neoliberal view. You know, there was a sense of, the world is coming together, post-Cold War boundaries are breaking down, and there will be great value to be drawn from Europe and America's interaction with the likes of China and Russia. It seemed a very optimistic time. It's partly one of the reasons why I ended up in China. That's what the University of Nottingham was engaged in, that kind of neoliberal hope. And one, again, mustn't denigrate that. You know, that there's a lot to be said for that kind of hope of interaction and a complex interactive world where an attention to that trans-societal and trans-cultural interaction could be progressive. You know, it could benefit people in all sorts of ways. But that's turned in on itself. I mean, after 2008, if we just take the case of China turned in on itself, like in the same way that America did. And because of economic shocks and that the neoliberal dream didn't quite work out, China developed its own dream. It already had it, to be honest. I think viewers will be interested in reading the article that you've attached to this podcast.
Would you mind just providing us with a bit of a summary for it?
Yeah, well, the article is titled "Green World Order with Chinese Characteristics, and its subtitle is Implications for Global Climate Cooperation. And I actually think the article is a very decent article. I think the conclusions that it draws, which I'll describe in a moment, are eminently justifiable. And what the article says is that China isn't really adopting significantly different tactics and strategies around the development of a green agenda. But what they have done, certainly since 2008 and after that, is try and put that on a Chinese footing, trying to put themselves at the center of that world, is to develop a Chinese characteristic version of how to develop a green society, one that should apply, in their view, to the rest of the world. And they're not doing that just in notional terms, but they're doing it through supply chains, technological development, the spreading of China-based standards around green technologies, all of which seems to me to be a perfectly sensible and reasonable argument on the part of the author. So I think it's an article that people should read. However, and this is not a criticism of the author as such, because I think any text, any written argument of that kind, whether it's academic or not, is always limited in its scope. But the thing which isn't discussed is, what does Chinese characteristics beyond the material and the socio-political, what does that mean? And what's being left out, I think, glaringly, is culture. What is it about Chinese cultural identity and its long-standing civilizational habitus? That's its, particular collective orientation towards certain values and attitudes.
Yeah. What
is that, and how does that impact on what the author is saying?
What I drew from the article is that there's this growing clarity around China's intent to become essentially the world lead on the green world, the green economy, the green technologies, etc., etc. When you talk about the cultural norms, is that around? Is it too simple to say that from a cultural perspective, China has this thirst and this desire to be the lead, and that perhaps that whole notion of kind of collaboration and partnership and all coming together to build a green world, that's not the frame of reference for China. What the frame of reference is let's use the green economy and green technology to win the race to being the most influential party when it comes to those things. Have I oversimplified that? And is that what you mean when you refer to the cultural element?
No, you haven't oversimplified it. What you've done is you framed that in a kind of, and this isn't a criticism, it's just an observation. I would have these tendencies as well, but we're framing that in a kind of European American way.
Okay.
This idea of winning and, all this kind of thing. I'm not going to go through a whole explanation of what the Western or the European American habitus is, but, it's a Judeo-Christian, Greek amalgam, and what it led to, certainly under European colonialism, imperialism, is a sense of control and ownership of the world. And so we tend to use these terms like we're in a struggle and we're trying to win something and all of this kind of thing. Now, that is true. That's not untrue. And there's certainly an element of that in China's attitude towards the green agenda. But what I'm going to do now is just talk a little bit about long-standing Chinese culture. And this is why I think addressing that question is important to just providing a richer understanding of the things that are described in the article about why China is doing what it does. Okay, so I'll start with one thing and then maybe we'll bring in some of the things related to further questions. But one thing is this idea of Tianxia. Now, Tianxia means everything under heaven. Now, this is a pretty much an immemorial Chinese idea And it goes back to the Zhou dynasty. So this is sort of 1046 onwards to kind of the late 700s BCE. So this is a long, long time ago. And the Zhou dynasty for Confucians is the notional golden age out of which Chinese culture grows. I won't go into further detail, but that's an important idea. Tianxia is the idea that that the whole of the world is Chinese. It's not just a matter of ownership. It's a matter of influence. And that influence is concentric. So you have to imagine China as an empire, not as we have it now, a nation state. And I would argue, we could talk about this later, as a nation state / empire. But China, historically, you know, from the time of the Han Dynasty onwards, maybe before, was an empire. It was a dynastic imperial state. And one of its justifications, amongst others, there's a whole constellation of ideas, some of which we'll come on to. But Tianxia is the idea that the imperial state emanates its influence and power from a central place, wherever the emperor is, the Chinese capital. And that hasn't always been Beijing, by the way. It's been in different places at different times. And China has been divided at times. It's been in a state of civil conflict. But Tianxia means that influence and power radiates from the seat of the empire, that of the emperor, and radiates outwards. So the first kind of level, it's like ring roads. In Beijing, you're used to this idea of ring roads going around the city. I suppose we might think of the M25. But the immediate sphere of influence is, say, within the M25. And that's the direct Chinese influence. And then the next layer are suzerainties or client states, which have significant Chinese influence, or China has a significant influence on, but they're not within that immediate sphere. Beyond that, there's the barbaric world. That is to say, the world that doesn't speak Chinese or Imperial Chinese. But significantly, under a Chinese cosmological view of everything, China owns the lot. Whether they are imperially present there or not, it doesn't matter.
That's fascinating, because you've, on the one hand, just described that notion of the barbaric world, the non-Chinese speaking world out there. But on the other hand, there's still this sense from China that the whole of the world is Chinese. And so how do those two things sit with one another?
You know, but let's say the British Empire. The empire was based on, you know, whatever was imperial was owned. You know, there was a British presence, and there was the extraction of resources and the use of people and occupation of territory. The Chinese dynastic imperial state doesn't have to occupy your land in order to own it, or for it to be under the influence. So there's it may be an apocryphal story, but it may be true as well. You know, British imperial delegations turning up in Beijing in the 19th century, showing off all sorts of kind of Western technology and being told to go away. And by the way, could you tell Queen Victoria that we very much enjoy the fact that she's looking after our possessions in the UK at the moment? There was that kind of powerful imperial, we would maybe say arrogance, but not for China. This was just cosmologically justified.
Is what you're describing in the fact that imperial view of China does not need to sort of manifest itself in our Western view of imperialism, i.e. the occupation of land per se, but actually things like investment in green technologies and trying to, you know, essentially advance themselves from that perspective allows them to have influence over countries around the world, and that influence is ultimately the kind of imperial charge and the imperial drive of China? Or have I, again...
No, that's reasonable. What I'm saying is, to decode the article, if one understands the conception of Tianxia, that does inform, I think, the author's view of a Chinese, a version of green economics and green technology with Chinese characteristics. The author doesn't say what the Chinese characteristics are beyond, the immediate sort of political and socio-economic. But part of that is informed by the traces of Tianxia, is developing a specifically Chinese view, which I think kind of reverts us to the historical Chinese imperial view. So it's green economics as a kind of an extension of Tianxia. It's important to think about this. China does want to, or at least Beijing wants to unify a territorial China, a greater China. So Hong Kong is an SAR, that's a special administrative region, but since 1997, it's back in the PRC, it's back in the People's Republic of China. Taiwan is certainly regarded as part of the People's Republic of China by Beijing, but it's a contested space at the moment. And it's also under threat of invasion to bring it back to the motherland. Right. The Chinese state might want to kind of have big material and occupational influence on the South China Sea, but its wider ambitions are not to completely occupy the world. That's not what China does. It doesn't want to do that. What it will do, though, is want to spread, what it does want to do is spread its influence. So, there is a policing of Chinese-speaking people outside of China, as we know. Hence some of the worries about the development of a super embassy in London, What are all of those rooms for? Now, I'm not an apologist for China, but I'm also somebody who would advise not to overly demonize the Chinese state in that sense. Its controls are limited. The One Belt, One Road initiative is a kind of extension, a modern day extension of the sort of client state, suzerainty structures that China developed historically as part of dynastic imperial China. So I wouldn't say they're exactly the same. Of course, they're modern and they've morphed under modern circumstances, but there are echoes and resonances and traces of that older Chinese view of the world. And I think that's reflected in the article, even though the author doesn't state it.
How does China view the rest of the world? How does it view it from a perspective of, we're talking about the green economy, we're talking about the green agenda, if you like. What is China's view of the rest of the world when it comes to that?
I think that's very variable. I don't think there's a kind of a single answer to that question. But China is certainly admiring in many ways of European American culture. There's all sorts of kind of material online where China, little films and this, that, and the other, about China admiring the achievements of the British Empire, for example, perhaps as a lesson to be learned, if you like, whilst also being politically opposed to occupation and influence of the British. Similar thing with America. I mean, Meigo is the Chinese term for America, which means beautiful country. So what you don't find necessarily is an antithetical view of the rest of the world. But as the article suggests, the disengagement with a global, interactive green agenda, which is really what's described in the article at one point, is done for reasons that I've just described about Chinese dynastic imperial worldview historically. But it's also, why would they want to deal with such an unreliable partner as the USA? I mean, if you think about it, over the past 20 years, USA has chopped and changed its position on numerous occasions, not just between Trump and democratic governments, but even within the democratic governments.
It's the speed with which, the Chinese system, let's call it, is able to, point in a particular direction. For example, we're going to invest in developing our green economy and green technologies. And because of everything being lined up towards that goal, and without the sort of the distractions, if you like, of changing policy and of changing views, etc., it's allowed them to be incredibly successful. So as you say, why would they bother if they can do it themselves and do it as quickly and as efficiently as they can? Why bother bringing anybody else in?
And promote that as a model for others. I mean, I think it's important. I mean, China is an authoritarian society, but I think that authoritarianism is complex. It's not a fundamentally anti-democratic society in the way that we in liberal democratic contexts understand that. But that doesn't mean to say it isn't a democratic society in its own terms. It's a socialist democracy. I mean, I could tell you all sorts of stories about that based on my time in China, but we probably don't have time. But I think just suffice to say, and without being an apologist for China, I don't want to be that, but I think it's important to understand Chinese authoritarianism as complex. It's not the way it's dressed up in the Western media, or certainly by people like Trump. It's not like that. But what it does do, as you've described it, if Beijing wants to achieve something, it can pretty much just do it. You know, if it wants to build high-speed trains, and it wants to build big airports, and it wants to build infrastructure, and it wants to change the whole housing policy of the state, and it's not a uniform state. I mean, you know, there's a great range of, you know, from wealth to poverty, extreme wealth to poverty in China. You know, it's still a developing country in that sense, and probably will never develop out of that. But in terms of material things, it can really get things done.
And often, I mean, one of the common themes that we all talk about, or often comes out of shows on The Responsible Edge, is we're talking about, you know, the lack of progress in light of some really, really difficult targets that we're all trying to collectively reach in order to address some very, very concerning and imminent dangers and threats that we have to the world that we live in. Is China the beacon of hope in that sense of how things can happen quickly and quickly enough that we might actually have a chance here?
Yes, no. I mean, the China's approach is not like that of the UK Labour government, which is currently, at least in posture, adopting a rather absolutist view of developing a green society. One which, as many commentators point out, could be economically disastrous for the UK economy. Others would argue, of course, with some justification, that if we don't take steps to deal with these issues, climate change will overtake us, and that will destroy our economies as well. So there's a tension, isn't there, in, let's say, the UK and other European governments between reaching those goals, you know, ecological goals, and addressing climate change, but not destroying your, you know, not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, not cutting your nose off or whatever, not destroying your society socially and economically. China has made huge steps because it can. But it has a pragmatic view. So when I was living in China, it was grey skies all the time. The pollution was very evident. Going back there, particularly since COVID, you know, you go back there and the strides are incredible. I mean, there are blue skies in the cities. I know that's just one indicator. But I was in Shenzhen, southwestern Chinese city, not far from Hong Kong, recently. And I was standing in a university overlooking the city with these huge buildings. I was thinking, there's something quite odd. I can't quite put my finger on it. And then I suddenly realized it. There's no traffic noise because of the ubiquity of electric cars. And when one goes into the city at night, it's quite unnerving compared to, say, the UK. So big achievements, clearly tangible achievements. At the same time, China's still building coal-fired power stations.
Indeed.
But they're doing that, you know, they're doing that not simply to be contrary. They're doing that because they feel that's necessary in order to transition their society into a greener economy. And I think there's a genuine desire in abstract political terms as well as material terms to develop a green Chinese society. But the problem is they're still doing things that run against that, certainly for the time being. And my Chinese friends could tell you all sorts of instances where they're still destroying the natural world.
But the point that you're making that I think is so compelling when you compare it to the way that we get ourselves in the Western world, I'm using huge generalizations here, but get ourselves wrapped up in our own need for, short-term political populist positioning of our political system, which is that it's an acceptance from a Chinese perspective that we might have to do certain things that are at odds with the ultimate outcome that we're trying to achieve, but we have a long-term view of what we're trying to achieve, and we'll do whatever it takes in order to get there.
Yeah, and that might not ultimately be helpful. Taking the pragmatic view might still destroy the world, but it's a tension. You can see there's a tension on both sides. Where taking the right steps might also be destructive as well as productive. I mean, I think it's worth mentioning, it really is worth mentioning, where that pragmatism comes from. And the Chinese communist, China's a socialist society now. It's not a communist society. It's run by the Chinese Communist Party. But as people often misconstrue, it's actually a multi-party state going forward in the face of all of this change. China over the past 40 years has undergone significant, arguably hugely traumatic change. So political appeals to some kind of socio-political cohesion, harmonization, and a harmonious society are important to the Chinese Communist Party. And it's partly, not completely, but it's partly informed by that historical Confucianist attitude.
We're going to conclude now. I'm going to hope that I'm going to get you back on for another show to unpick another sort of one of these areas. But for now, if I was to hand you a magic wand, Paul, and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant, what would that one thing be? It's
not a magic wand. It's simply an appeal, and it's a. Let me put it this way: that article that you've upheld in relation to this discussion is in many ways typical of academic discourse. It focuses on the socio-economic and the political. Nothing wrong with that. Those are important things. And I'm certainly not opposed to that discussion. But I often think that in order to decode some aspects of that discussion and give a richer view of that, one has to address culture, as we've been talking about. Now, a lot of academics don't go down that road. Many do, but a lot don't, because it's soft and it's intangible and it's difficult to prove and all of this kind of thing. And I agree with that. It's difficult. But I think leaving it out rather limits the discussion. Now, that's not just for the academic world, but I think the commercial world, which is always going to be focused on the material, on the socio-political, and particularly the bottom line in a capitalist world, it's easy to overlook culture. What value is it? But I think what ought to change is to have more people that can give a sophisticated interpretation of issues that draw on culture, and particularly transcultural issues. What we've been talking about is not just China, but the construction of the modern world through the relationship between Europe, America, and other westernized states and China. And you could bring other things in. You could bring other sides. We just don't have scope for that. China's our focus today. But if I could change anything, it would be that. Now, lots of people in cultural studies would immediately say, we do that. But I don't think that has spread beyond those specific concerns far enough.
And Paul, let me push you on that. So let's say that the magic wand has had to role to play here, and suddenly we have, let's say, beyond the walls of academia, we have a general greater appreciation, awareness, empathy, compassion, if you like, for different cultural perspectives around the world, what are the implications of that? What happens as a result of that?
Now, before I answer that question, I'll just say one thing. I'm not a typical, I'm as liberal as the next person in my sphere of work, but I'm not somebody who just buys into that uncritically. I think we have to be careful about adopting extremely liberal attitudes simply because we think they're morally right or whatever. You've got to be more pragmatic about it than that. I think an attention, though, to the multiplicity of cultural viewpoints, particularly when it comes to big issues like climate change, would go a long way to informing the debate. I mean, the debate globally involves lots of different societies and cultures. I think they often have a great deal of difficulty in asserting their particular cultural points of view. I think the debate remains, despite protestations, it remains westernized.
Well, let's hope, and I take this from partly our conversation today and what the article kind of alludes to, perhaps with China, its growing success in developing its own green economy and the green technologies associated with it, will be able to start to influence perhaps that narrative that we have collectively around the green agenda. And if that happens, would you hope that's a positive step because that does produce that greater degree of understanding and appreciation across borders?
Yeah, I think my answer is still yes, no. I think,
okay.
Of course, you get to invite an academic onto one of these podcasts. You're always going to get a grey answer, aren't you? Yes, I agree with you. I think it's positive, and I think as long as there's some understanding of the cultural imperatives which inform that, as well as the socio-political and material imperatives. Yes, of course, I think it's important, but we should not address China uncritically. We should not simply dress China up as some perfect exemplar of how to develop a green society for all of the reasons that I have given.
Hear, hear. We'll leave it there. Paul, thank you so much for joining me this morning. That was a whistle-stop tour, I know, but fascinating, really fascinating. Appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, absolute pleasure. Let's do it again because there's a whole bunch of stuff which informs what I was talking about today, which we haven't touched on, which I think is really important to discuss as well, but for another show.
And that's all for today's episode of The Responsible Edge. A massive thank you to Professor Paul Gladston for joining me on today's show and sharing his deep, deep knowledge on all things China. As a reminder, this episode was brought to you by TrueMark, the mark of trusted communications. Visit truemark.com to learn more. I'm Charlie Martin. Thanks for listening. And don't forget to subscribe, share, and leave us a review. See you next time.